The sun came up slow over Tucson, painting the adobe walls a weary orange. But it wasn't the light that woke the town. It was the silence. No wagon wheels, no shopkeeper's call, just a stillness that felt like a held breath, and the dozen men and women standing frozen on the boardwalk, staring at the bank of Tucson. 6 rough-hewn coffins sat in a neat row on the dry dirt in front of the bank doors. Each lid had a name carved deep with a knife: Curtis Harlan, Wade Briggs, Buck Larson, Jeb Maddox, Cole Whitmore, and Roy Taggart. The 6 names everyone in Tucson knew, Mayor Rook's enforcers. The meanest, most feared men in town. Someone had spelled out their mortality before breakfast. The bank manager, a thin man with a nervous mouth, cracked open the heavy door, saw the coffins, and turned the color of old milk. He stumbled back inside. A minute later, the upstairs window of the mayor's office flew open. Silas Rook's voice, thick with sleep and fury, demanded to know who had done this. Nobody answered. The street was too stunned to move. And then a new sound, a horse's steady hoofbeats, climbing from the southern road. Every neck turned. The rider was just a shape against the dawn at first, a man on a dark horse, moving unhurried into town. He wore a faded beige hat and a bright red bandana. His rifle rested easy across his lap. He didn't stop at the hitching post. He guided his horse right up to the side of the bank, close enough for the mayor to see his face, and when he looked up at that open window, a few men in the street realized they recognized him. 5 years gone. The marshal who'd refused to play Rook's game, the one they'd run out of town with a public humiliation and a closed fist. The cowboy didn't smile. He didn't shout. His voice carried clear and soft, the way a quiet man's voice can travel farther than a scream. "Pray for rain, Mr. Rook," he said, "because this town will burn." The mayor stepped back from the window. The cowboy turned his horse and rode toward the livery stable without looking back. To understand why those coffins had names on them, you have to go back just a few hours, to the night before. Martha Whitfield, a widow with sharp eyes and hands that had never stopped working, stood on the porch of the ranch her husband had built. The same ranch the bank now claimed she owed $700 on. A debt she'd never signed for, with interest that had multiplied like a sickness. The date on the loan paper was 2 months before her husband died, but the signature wasn't his. Anyone with half a brain could see it. The county judge hadn't bothered to look. That afternoon, Curtis Harlan himself had ridden out to her door with 2 men and an eviction order. He'd let the paper drop at her feet. "Noon tomorrow," he'd said. "This place belongs to the bank." He'd smiled the way a man smiles when he knows you have no one to call. The other 2 had laughed, and they'd ridden off, dust floating in the air like a slow, dirty cloud. Martha hadn't wept. She'd picked up the paper, folded it precisely, and tucked it into her apron. Then she'd walked to the barn and fed the horses, because work was the only prayer she knew. But she'd looked down the empty road long after the riders were gone, and she'd thought about the town full of people who'd seen it happen and said nothing. 11 families before her had lost their land to the same bank, the same oily signature, the same bought judge. The town had watched each time. Nobody had lifted a finger. Nobody except the one man they'd run out 5 years ago. The quiet marshal who'd tried to stop it all and been left bleeding in the street for his trouble. He'd come back now with 6 coffins and a promise that felt more like a statement of fact. The morning sun climbed higher, and the clock on the bank tower ticked toward noon. Inside, the manager was still at the window, staring at the names on those wooden lids. Outside, the town waited, knowing that whatever came next, it had already started before they were awake. I saw him an hour later crossing the empty lot behind the feed store. The town was still buzzing like a kicked hive, but he walked through the noise the way a stone sinks through water, untouched, unhurried. He'd left his horse at the livery and was on foot now, hands empty. That bright red bandana the only flash of color in a town that had suddenly gone gray with fear. He didn't go to the bank. He went to the barber shop. Not for a shave. He asked the barber, old man Fletcher, one question. Something about a man named Raymond Sims. Fletcher told him Sims worked at the bank but lived on the South Alley. A small house with a loose shutter. The stranger nodded once and left. That was it. The whole conversation took maybe 20 seconds. But I could see Fletcher's hands shake for a full minute after. I followed at a distance because something in me needed to see what this exile had come back to finish. He found Sims' house easy enough. The place looked tired, paint peeling, but the garden out front was neat, a man who still cared about small things. The stranger knocked softly. When Sims opened the door, he didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. He'd been expecting someone. Maybe not this man, but someone. He'd kept the real ledgers under his floorboard for 3 years, he said later, waiting for the right courier. The stranger said very little. He just pointed at the door and said, "Inside. Show me." I didn't go in. I leaned against the adobe wall of the alley and listened through the open window. Sims pulled up a loose board and lifted out 2 thick leather-bound books. He spread them on his kitchen table. The stranger turned the pages slowly, reading with a kind of surgical patience. He'd see a number, pause, then trace the corresponding forgery in the bank's official copies. 11 families, Sims explained. Each one had been handed a fake debt, $700 here, $500 there, with interest compounding at 40% a month. The signatures were copied from old letters. The notary stamp was stolen from a dead man's desk. Mayor Rook's people had made it look official enough that the local judge never questioned it. But the original ledger told a different story. The real debts were tiny, $20, $30, things long paid off. The rest was pure fabrication. And then the stranger found something that made him pause for a long time. It was a note Sims had tucked into the back of the ledger, a handwritten copy of a federal banking statute from 1878. I heard him read it aloud, just a few lines. Any territorial bank that engages in systematic fraud forfeits its charter, and its property reverts to the depositors. He looked at Sims. "How long you had this?" Sims said he'd dug it up at the territorial library 2 years ago, but he'd never had the nerve to use it. The stranger closed the ledger, thanked him, and stood up. "The Federal Examiner gets this before Sunday," he said. "The auction's Friday. That gives us 48 hours. He walked out of that house with the ledger under his arm, and I finally understood what the coffins were for. They weren't a threat of fire. They were a clock, and the stranger was already counting down to something that this town had never seen before. Justice arriving not on horseback with guns blazing, but in an envelope signed by a man Rook had never thought to worry about. The countdown had started the moment that red bandana appeared on the southern road. I kept to the shadows after that because a man holding a ledger the size of a small child draws attention in Tucson. And I didn't want to be the one standing next to him when the storm broke. He walked straight to the Western Union office, the little adobe shack next to the assay office, and spent about 10 minutes inside. I saw the telegraph operator's face through the window, pale, nodding too many times. When the stranger came out, the leather satchel he'd had earlier was gone. So was the heavy bulge of the ledger. That's when I knew he'd made a copy or sent the whole thing. And he wasn't carrying the evidence anymore. It was already somewhere else. He went to the hotel, the old Territorial. 2 stories of sun-bleached wood and a porch that sagged in the middle. He rented a room, took the key, climbed the stairs. I watched from across the street, nursing a cup of cold coffee I hadn't paid for. About 20 minutes later, he came back down, empty-handed, except for that same red bandana and the patient look of a man who'd already finished his day's work. He walked out the back toward the livery, and I lost sight of him. An hour later, Curtis Harlan came through the front door of the hotel with 3 men at his back. They moved like men who expected trouble and had brought enough of it to share. I knew all 4 of them. Buck Larson, the one with the busted nose, Jeb Maddox, tall and silent, who never blinked, Roy Taggart, who smiled at funerals, and Harlan himself, square-shouldered, breathing like a bull. The same names painted on those coffin lids that morning. The whole town had seen the list, and now here they were, walking into the same building where the stranger had just checked in, like the coffins meant nothing, like they were immune. I stayed across the street. The hotel clerk, a scared boy of maybe 17, pointed toward the stairs. Harlan didn't ask for a key. He went up with 2 of the men. Maddox stayed in the lobby, blocking the door. I could hear their boots on the wooden floor above, heavy, deliberate, searching. Then a door slammed open, then silence. A full minute passed. Maddox shifted his weight. The boy behind the counter looked like he wanted to disappear. Then Harlan came back down the stairs, slower this time, holding a folded piece of paper. He opened it in the middle of the lobby, read it twice, and his face went from anger to something I'd never seen on a man like that before. Something that looked a lot like fear. I found out later what the note said. Just 5 words written in a firm, unhurried hand. The ledger is already in Cheyenne. No signature, no postmark, just the truth, sitting on the hotel bed like a polite eviction notice. The federal banking examiner in Cheyenne had already received the evidence before any of Rook's men could lay a finger on it. The clock had run out, and those 4 men standing in the hotel lobby suddenly understood that the coffins weren't a threat of violence. They were an announcement that the violence was over, and they'd lost before they even drew. Harlan folded the note, slid it inside his jacket, and looked at the clerk. "Where is he now?" The boy shook his head, honest. He didn't know. Nobody did. The stranger was gone, and the proof of everything was already a day's ride away, heading toward a federal desk that Silas Rook couldn't buy. I remember thinking, as Harlan and his men walked out into the afternoon empty-handed, that the mayor's whole operation had just been gutted by 5 words on hotel stationery. And the man who wrote them wasn't even in town anymore. Or maybe he was, waiting for the right moment to walk into the mayor's office unarmed. You never know with a man who doesn't need to be seen. I caught sight of him again around 4 that afternoon. The light was starting to slant, turning the dust into something almost pretty. He walked out of the livery stable with a leather satchel slung over his shoulder, a small one, the kind a man might carry if he had only a few important papers and nothing else. His rifle was nowhere in sight, just the satchel and that red bandana. He didn't go toward the hotel. He went straight up the middle of Main Street, past the saloon where Curtis Harlan was still nursing a bruised ego, past the general store where Martha Whitfield sometimes bought flour on credit, and stopped in front of the town hall. That's where Mayor Rook kept his office, a big room on the 2nd floor, with a desk the size of a wagon bed and a window that looked down on the whole town. I followed, staying back. A few other folks noticed him too, shopkeepers, a couple of idlers, and they drifted toward the building like iron filings to a magnet. Nobody spoke. We all just watched him push open the heavy door and disappear into the cool, dark hallway inside. I found a spot near an open window on the ground floor, a little office that nobody was using. I could hear the stairs creak under his boots, slow and steady. Then the mayor's door opening. No knock. Rook's voice came first, sharp and full of authority. "I've been expecting you." He sounded like a man who still thought he held every card. I couldn't see what happened next, but I heard the stranger set that satchel on the desk. The sound was small, just a soft thump of leather on polished wood. Then the mayor's chair scraped back. "You think you can walk in here and threaten me? I have a territorial injunction signed by Judge Merriweather this morning." There was a rustle of papers, like a man waving something in the air. "It orders you to cease interfering with the lawful business of the Tucson Land and Cattle Bank or face arrest." The stranger's voice came back, low and calm. "That injunction applies to local matters. I'm not here about a local matter." Rook laughed, but it was a thin sound with no weight behind it. "Everything in this town is a local matter. Not when it involves systematic fraud across 11 families, the stranger said. I heard the satchel being opened, then a sheaf of papers laid flat on the desk. "These are copies of the original ledgers your bookkeeper kept. I sent the originals to the federal banking examiner in Cheyenne 3 hours ago." A pause. I remember the exact quality of it. Not silence, exactly. The street still hummed outside, but inside that room, the air stopped moving. Rook's voice changed, getting tighter. "I don't care what ledger you think you have. The bank's charter is good in this territory." "The charter was issued under territorial law, yes," the stranger said, and his tone didn't rise at all. "But the Federal Banking Act of 1878 requires honest accounting as a condition of every charter's validity. If a bank engages in systematic forgery, its charter is revoked at the federal level. Not territorial. Federal." I heard Rook take a step back, his boots scuffed on the floor. When he spoke again, the bluster was gone, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. "You can't. You don't have the authority." "I don't need any authority," the stranger said. "The examiner has the ledger. The statute is public. All I had to do was get the right document to the right desk. I've done that. What happens next isn't something you can stop with a local judge's signature." I realized my palms were sweaty. Outside, the people who'd gathered were whispering, sharing what they could hear through the window. The stranger's words were spreading like water. Rook didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just sat down. I heard the chair groan, and for a long moment, nothing else. Then his voice very small. "What do you want?" The stranger didn't answer right away. I think he might have looked out the window at the coffin, still sitting in front of the bank, their names stark and permanent. When he did speak, it was almost gentle. "I want the auction canceled. Every fraudulent debt cleared. The families get their land back. And you resign your office by Monday." The chair didn't move. Outside, someone let out a breath. I knew in that quiet that the whole town had just heard the mayor of Tucson lose everything. I stayed by that window long after the stranger walked out of the mayor's office. He didn't look left or right, just passed through the crowd like they were smoke. The satchel was still slung over his shoulder, but it looked lighter now, as if the weight of the documents wasn't the only thing he'd set down. The door clicked shut behind him, and for a second nobody moved. Then, like a dam breaking, the whispers started. The mayor didn't come down those stairs for an hour. When he did, his face was the color of old newspaper. He walked straight to the bank, unlocked the door himself, and put a handwritten sign in the window. "Closed by order of federal examiner." I saw him do it. The ink was still wet. He didn't look at the 6 coffins still sitting there, but his hand shook a little when he pressed the paper to the glass. By sundown, the whole town knew. 11 families were getting their land back. The debts were fraud. And Silas Rook had tendered his resignation, effective immediately. The deputy mayor, a man who'd spent 4 years terrified to say no, accepted it before anyone could talk him out of it. Curtis Harlan and his crew didn't stick around. I saw them ride out just before dusk, heading east, their faces set, but their shoulders sagging. No farewells, no threats, just 4 men who'd been on the wrong side of a countdown, and knew it. The other 2, the ones whose names were on the coffin lids, but who'd already left town that morning, were long gone. The coffins sat untouched, a silent reminder of the promise that had never been about fire. The next morning, I went to the bank. The doors were open, but the windows were bare. Inside, the counter was empty except for one thing, a $20 gold piece shining on the dark wood. Someone had placed it there before dawn. No note, no explanation. But I knew. Raymond Sims, the bookkeeper, was standing behind the counter with a broom in his hand, as if he could sweep away the last 3 years. He looked tired but lighter, like a man who'd finally put down a heavy box. I asked him about the coin. He just nodded. "That's for the one real debt," he said. "Mr. Whitfield owed $20 when he died. The stranger paid it. I'll see it gets to the right place." Martha Whitfield came to town around noon. She walked straight to the coffins, and I saw her pull a folded white cloth from her apron. A tablecloth, maybe, or a piece of an old sheet. She picked up each coffin lid, one by one, and set them aside, then spread the white cloth over the empty boxes like a flag of truce. She stood there a moment, facing the bank, and then she turned to the crowd that had gathered. "My husband's ranch is secure," she said. Her voice didn't waver. "All of ours are. The man who did this asked nothing, but he left this for us." She pointed at the white cloth. "It's a reminder. The fire he promised was never for this town. It was for the lies. And it's out now." I didn't see the stranger again. I heard he rode north before first light, heading toward the mountains. Someone said they saw him stop at the edge of town and look back once, his red bandana bright against the pale dawn. Then he was gone. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support is what brings these stories to more people.